Hey folks, welcome to week two. If anyone on Slack could give me an indication that the sound is working, that would be a good way to start. Alrighty, thank you so much. Okay, so last week we had a look at HTML for the first time. So we're going to do a bit of a recap to kick things off and start looking at CSS as well to start styling our HTML. So we saw a whole host of HTML elements last week, possibly for the first time for a lot of people. You can go check out the HTML Living Standard, which exists on the working group page. I have linked there. There's so many different types of working groups, which I think I explained them properly in subsequent lectures. But we're going to focus today and mainly the course, looking at, well, the course itself, looking at all of these kind of structural elements and moving down to table elements. We won't do so many forms, I don't think. But we'll cover the majority of the highlighted elements as we move through. So just as a recap, to bring up some of the elements again, the structural elements, and the main one is the HTML root element. So using the term root as the beginning is something you should get used to. So this is essentially the outer container, and everything else is contained within this to form your HTML document. You basically should be able to see this on every page that you visit. Every page that you create as well should have an open and closing HTML, and then the entirety of your content and your metadata and your head will be contained within that HTML document. Now, if you leave it out, your browser will do an attempt at rendering, but you can't rely on that for consistency across browsers, or even the same browser one day to the next. So the head element is another structural element, and it contains metadata and, I guess, information about the page as well, such as the title. But it also instructs the browser where to find things like style sheets or JavaScript files. There's a whole host of elements that can typically go in the head. Today we'll look at style sheets when we go to the next slide deck. But essentially we end up defining a lot of different relationships between this document and other documents on the website, or files essentially. The body then wraps around all of the content that we see on the screen, and we can delete the body tag and we'll delete the entire content. So the body tag will contain all of our headings, all of our paragraphs, all of our lists. And you shouldn't, by regular practice, just put text within the body tag. You should put the text within the likes of paragraph or headings, as we show here. Again, if you put the text in the body tag, I'm pretty sure your browser will take a good chance at rendering it, but you'll have very little control over how it looks and the consistency across browsers and operating systems and things like that. So the heading elements, we have 1 to 6 headings, with H1 indicating the most important heading on your page. And the browser will give that some default style. And we'll see today how to change that style. We could make 1 to 6 look the same if we wanted. I don't know what that would get you, but you can. But we have 6 headings to add structure to the web page, and this was one of the earlier attempts to add semantic meaning to the markup, so that potentially just by looking at the page source, you could see, and looking at the page content as well, I guess you could see what's more important, what's less important. And that semantic meaning is important, and semantics just means you're able to tell from the element or the tag itself, something about its intention and what it means. So typically, the first heading is H1, and we move on down through the different headings depending on how we want to level out our content. You can't put block level elements in here. You can try, but again, if we remember from last week, where we had inline and block elements, something like an image or a bold or an emphasis would be an inline element, whereas a paragraph or a heading would be a block element. So it would give you a line break before and after the element, so it sticks out as a block in the page on its own. But if you try and think, well, within a heading, why would I want to put a block element in there? It doesn't really make sense, so it's not really supported. But give it a try and see what happens. Again, it could change day to day how that renders in a browser if it's a kind of an unsupported state. And it's worth opening up, the different Mozilla Developer Network and things like that and seeing what tags are supported within each tag. But honestly, I went years of my career without having to worry about that, because generally you don't end up trying to do those weird things. Another element we have structural is a block quote, which allows you to mark up a block of text, say it's quoted from a source or from another person. We'll use this a little bit in the labs as well. Could just be a few lines, or it could be several paragraphs, and depending, and you can, if you want to do some paragraphs in there, you need to use the paragraph tag in there as well. So we had a look at the line break tag last week and the multiple different kind of ways you can write it. But as we mentioned in the last lecture, just pressing enter and putting a new line in your IDE or in your text editor won't put that line break, when the browser won't render that line break. Sorry, is a more correct way of saying it. You need to use the line break or BR tag. And those, are typically contained in the likes of paragraphs. So the paragraph element, one of the most commonly used, and I kind of have said paragraph far too many times already. It's kind of losing all meaning. But that just goes to show how often it's used. You end up using, the paragraph to essentially put your content together on the page. And because you really don't want to be putting your text and things like that just in the body tag, or throwing it around different tags. So typically you end up using a paragraph. It's a block item, block element, which means it'll give you a line break above and below, and you can put inline elements in the paragraph. So you can put the line breaks in there. You can also put things like bold, which we'll discuss. We probably don't want to do later on, but you can, or some emphasis or italics or things like that, anchor tags and image tags, and the like. So if we take a look at what we can actually put inside of the head as well, so the title is a nice satisfying one because it lets you see what's going on in your browser tab. And some browsers support that changing dynamically as well. So if you were to go to, I guess, Google and just type in a stopwatch, Google will give you a stopwatch. And if you press start, you can see the title updating every few seconds with the time. Now, some browsers support that and some don't. So I wouldn't build your business on it. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But it's and when we all have 700 tabs open, what's going on in the title is pretty important to us because we can pick out what we're actually working on. And let me just get my pen here. Get that out of the way. And if we notice in our title here, we have a little icon. It's typically called a favicon, and you can define that in the head as well. There may or may not be a slide for that here. I can't remember, but that's also something you can define in the head, which can be quite useful when you have a million tabs open. So inside of the head as well, we can put style embedded into the head. We typically, we can do it for smaller pages, I guess, but we'll learn about style sheets as we move on through this lecture. But we can use a style tag to define aspects, the style aspects of a page. And so we would use CSS to do that. So that's, here we have, an example of CSS, setting the background color, different margins, different borders, and different fonts. So moving into more of the text formatting elements, one we would have come across last week is the anchor, which we would all prefer to be called link, I would say. But no, it's not. It is an anchor tag. There is a link tag, which we will get to later. But we usually call this, I guess, a link or a hyperlink. Hyperlink is a dated term, which I doubt is used anymore. But lots of different attributes can fit in here. And if we remember from last week, the different, we have our opening of our tag, and then we have our attributes in it here. So, we have an attribute for a href here, and we can have an attribute here for a target as well, which will tell us, open up the page that we click on here in a new tab, and different things like that. So you can go and look at the documentation for Anchor as well, and you can see a whole host of the different attributes to go in there. And one thing you don't usually think of is you can link within the current page as well. Using URL anchors, I think they're called. The name is after escaping me, the joys of live. But you can link into a certain part on the page as well, so that you could share a link and it would jump straight down into the page, or you can use it to jump around the page when you're viewing an article, let's say. Yeah, so that's the, what do we call them? A location within the current page is typically with the hash new releases, and it will jump down to the ID of new releases. There's a specific name on that, which I can't remember at the moment, but we'll keep going. We also have emphasis, which in this case will put text in line in italics. So you could change that with CSS to do something else if you prefer for emphasis. But the default behavior is typically italics in most browsers. So we have another text formatting element, and this is for inline quotations. So I guess when we looked at the block quote, it does what it says in the name, gives us a block. But if we want to do an inline, we can just use the Q tag, which would be a quote. And we can see it rendering here at the bottom. It puts in the quotation marks for us as well. Which can just, help us because sometimes quotations need to be escaped and sometimes they don't. But if you use the Q, you're all good and the browser will do it for you. So then on to unordered lists. So there's a couple of lists we'll cover here, an ordered list and an unordered list. So an unordered list is essentially just bullet points. So, group a collection of items together in a list. Nothing too crazy there. You could use it to, create a directory for your website and that kind of thing. And an ordered list then will give us, instead of bullets, it'll give us a number list that will increment. The browser will increment itself, so you don't have to keep track, which is useful. And then we have the image. So lets us embed an image inside of a document. So we would have used this inside the lab last week. Again, lots of different attributes. We typically end up using source and alternative. So if the image can't be displayed, this is what the browser will display. Typically, a missing image icon with your alternative text there. And you can augment the height and width and things like that using the image tag. A lot of times you end up doing that with CSS, I would say, to give you more control, as we'll see later. The span then is a confusing one because, there's no real meaning to it. It's just, it doesn't really change how the text within the span renders. But what you're doing, and you'll see this as we move into CSS, is you're providing what we might like to call a hook. So if we have a span here, the browser will basically ignore it unless we give it some style, typically with CSS. What you usually end up doing is giving it an ID attribute so that you can target it specifically and give it a specific style, or you might want to target it via JavaScript. So we'll see this later, but the span does nothing unless you do something with it. So the browser won't really do anything with it unless, you can style all spans using CSS if you wanted to. But typically you end up giving it an ID or a class, which we'll see later, that you can target with CSS to do something to spans with that ID or that class. And you'll see that a bit later. So again, I've been mentioning attributes, and to just think about, as a recap, how the attributes fit in to our tags and into our elements. You see, we open up our element, and realistically, we're not going to put that there. So that's a typo, I guess. And, we have our tag opened, we have our attributes, and then we have our closing, and then we have our content, and then we have our closing tag. So again, the href here and the source and the alternative of the image are attributes, and their properties and values, or keys and values as people like to call them as well. So common attributes we might see, that essentially can be applied to all HTML elements. So when you go look at the documentation, you'll see that some elements will have very specific attributes. A lot of them will have a subset that, are the same. And things like class, ID, and style exist on pretty much every HTML element out there. And they're essentially used for the likes of class or ID, used for selecting an element with CSS or selecting an element with JavaScript, so you can maybe move it around the page or something like that. So we'll use this a bit more now as we move through the CSS. Okay, quick recap and then a quick introduction to the attributes we're going to be kind of targeting here. But we're going to just look at CSS from a very basic intro. We'll move a bit quickly through it. So let's give it a go. So we'll start talking about CSS, and up to now, I guess, the pages we've been looking at have been pretty plain, black and white text and things like that. And we can now use CSS to add presentation to our web pages. And the distinction between, I guess, structure, style, and function is an interesting one to think about. And we kind of want to keep all of these things separate. So the markup, so our HTML is, our structure and our content. Our styling is typically done or is done with CSS. So CSS for our presentation and appearance. And then any kind of actions that our page will do typically is JavaScript. However, there's a bit of a movement at the moment, and I could share a link. I think I have a link somewhere that I was reading last week where, there's a lot of functionality and quote unquote action coming into JavaScript, or sorry, coming into CSS, which allows people to make quite an interactive page without having to have JavaScript in their pages. And that means, typically pages can potentially run faster within the browser because it's not worried about running JavaScript. And then if you don't need to have any code within, JavaScript code within your, your presentation and your markup, it can save you a bit of time in development as well. So hopefully I will remember to share that link if I can find it again. But it's just interesting to see that there's more and more push, and it's still going on, to maybe make CSS do some of the stuff you would rely on JavaScript to do in the past. So if we think about our content, this is our HTML and all of our content that we've been looking at so far. Images, animation, sounds, things like that. Our presentation defines how the content will appear to a human who accesses the document. I guess human is pointed out here because screen readers and things, they may take cues from CSS, but typically they want to take cues from the HTML elements and the meaning of those rather than the meaning, inferring meaning from the style. Inferring meaning from the style would be not great. So yeah, the behavior then, typically that layer is JavaScript, but as I said, it's blurring a little bit with CSS and what CSS can do. Again, we'll do an intro into kind of JavaScript at the end of this. We will most likely do, well, let me think of your modules. It's part of the Cert. No, you may not do JavaScript on the server side either. That might be in year 2. And but we will go through what JavaScript is, play around with it a small bit, and you can, leave the course knowing how you can start learning more about how JavaScript will work. So what we've been talking about, I guess, 3 different areas. So the content, the presentation, and the behavior. And what we want to do is separate those out a lot, as much as possible, within reason. And that's typically known as something like separation of concerns. And separation of concerns is something you end up with in your head, for the entirety of your software engineering, or particularly when you're developing things. You want a separation of concerns either in, the very complicated class structures you're making in Java or the websites you're making. So it's possible inside of a single HTML document to put the presentation, the behavior, and the, I guess, the content all in the same tag, potentially all in the same page. And, we've looked at the emphasis, we've looked at the bold tag, and this is introducing presentation into our structure, which may or may not be something that we want to do, because it might make things more difficult to change at a later date. Typically, we want to keep all of our layers separate. So keeping the layers of, presentation, function, and content separately allows us to modify, replace each individual layer separately as well. And you'll see that a lot as you move through different areas of software engineering as well. Separation of concerns will come up a lot in, say, design meetings or just brainstorming sessions when you're maybe trying to design different class structures and things like that. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's a recommended way to control the presentation on the web. The main advantage, I guess, of CSS over presentational HTML, and when we say presentation HTML, we mean tags like emphasis and bold, is that we can keep the styling aspect completely separate from the content. And that's important when your websites start getting bigger and you want to make things easier to maintain. And maintenance is a big kind of concern with why you would be concerned with separation of concerns. It's a mouthful. But CSS itself, gives better control over presentation than any of the presentational elements as well. And as I mentioned as well, it's kind of moving into the realm of making your website a bit more interactive as well. So it's blurring some lines, but there's, I guess, different groups and task forces that will, keep the lines where they should be. So I think a style sheet makes sense. It's a sheet or a document with all of our style in it, but like, what does cascading mean and why is it there? It essentially means, as you cascading in CSS, it means the styles will cascade down from several sources. So you can think of your root element, your H element, your body element, and let's say we can put a style on our body element that will then be cascaded and applied down to all of the elements within it, unless you end up superseding them and overriding those styles within the elements themselves. So if you had a body with a paragraph, you gave that paragraph a specific font that was different in the body, it will take that, whereas everything else in the body that doesn't define a font will take the font you've designed for the body. So the styles will cascade down, and it's the kind of thing that is hard to kind of talk about and to kind of take in as a concept. But as soon as you start using CSS, it kind of makes sense that that's how it works. And you'll see that as we move through. So let's talk about how we define style using CSS. And the first thing we want to think about and define the term is the CSS rule. So a rule typically is a way of selecting one or many elements and contains many different properties that we want to augment the style of. So in this case, this whole thing is a rule here. And the first thing we're doing is we're selecting. So this is our selector. So that's something that's said a lot when you're talking about CSS and even JavaScript as well. And then we have our curly braces. So here we're selecting or targeting every paragraph element. And we have a property in here, which has a value of red. So we're setting the background color of all of our paragraphs to red by doing this. We should notice too that we have a semicolon at the end. That's needed. And we also have a colon in between the property name and the value. So this is just the syntax of how you define a CSS rule. So we have our rule is the entire thing. We have our selector, and we have our properties, which you can see as kind of keys and values or properties and values. And we can have multiple properties within a rule. So here we have our multiple properties where we're setting our background color and the border for all of our paragraphs. So you can see they're just on different lines, and it's important to have the semicolon at the end of each. Or whatever is parsing your CSS files, so be it your browser or whatever, doesn't get too confused. So here we have an example of a simple HTML file and a CSS style sheet. There's a few things to take in here, even though it's a bit smaller. So we have our parser declaration at the top. We have our HTML tag opened. You see it closed down the bottom here, and everything else contained in there. And what we want to look at first is, I guess, the head. And we won't talk about the character set for now, but we'll take a look at this link here. You can see the relationship between the document we're linking to and the current page is that it's a style sheet, and this is style.css, so it's going to be sitting next in the same directory as the index page on the server, or in the same, I guess, location in an S3 bucket or something. And we can see here in our style.css, we have our h1 defined to have text color of blue, background color of yellow, and a border of 1 pixel. And then all of our paragraphs are red. So if we're going to have a look and see how that renders, a thing of beauty. Beautiful website. But we can see we have our yellow background color in our heading, our blue text there as well, a border around it, and then the remaining text inside the other paragraph tag, or the only paragraph tag, I guess, is red. So that's the beginning of us starting to use CSS in a separate file to start styling and managing the presentation of our website. So if we would look at that file, we have 2 rules in there, and the first rule has 3 properties, and the second rule only has 1. So the first rule, I guess the selector is h1. So it's the most important heading on our page. Then we have our curly braces, and then we're setting the text color, we're setting the background color, and we're setting the border. And MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, has information on all these rules and the values you can put on them. All these properties, excuse me, and the values you can put on them. The second rule we have selects all paragraphs and sets the text in those to red. So hopefully you're seeing, it's pretty declarative. It's, I don't want to say simple because the devil is always in the detail of these things. But at least conceptually, you can look at that without knowing too much about what you're doing and kind of tell what's going to happen here. So, all first degree headings, color blue, it's a bit ambiguous. Maybe I should say text blue, text color or whatever. But then we have background color of yellow and a border, a solid border around it. Excuse me. So here is, it rendered using CSS. And yeah, it's not going to set the world alight yet. But again, we build and build on the complexity. So it's worth knowing how the CSS works. And typically, most browsers will document in detail the order within which certain items and certain pages are loaded. And strangely enough, it's quite important to know that, particularly when you're working in JavaScript and loading JavaScript files and things like that. You want to do certain things until everything is rendered. So typically it's a known workflow or I guess state diagram to see how CSS actually does work. So the first thing that happens is we load the HTML, we parse the HTML, at the same time we're loading the CSS as well. But what happens when we parse the HTML is we create something called the DOM, Document Object Model. And that's what we're interacting with when we go into DevTools. We're interacting with the DOM at that time, like we would have done last week. So the DOM represents the document inside of the browser, inside of the computer's memory. And the CSS is parsed separately and then the styles are attached to the DOM nodes. And then the browser displays the contents of the document object model, or the DOM. So for CSS, it's not too important to kind of remember how all this happens, but knowing that the browser takes your markup, your HTML, and creates an in-memory version of it called the DOM is an important concept to know if you're moving into web development. So one thing we want to look at here is the link element. So we've seen this in our example already. So this is how we link in style sheets into our HTML document. So this type here is a MIME type that you want to put as part of your link. But however, like of recent, if the relationship is defined as a style sheet, you don't need to include the type anymore. You can keep putting it there, but you go read the documentation and saying, well, we're mature enough now that we use CSS for styling. And, if we know that the relationship is a style sheet, you don't need to include the type or the MIME type. I mean, as an extension to that, you could say, well, this is a CSS file. Why do I need to include the relation? But that's not, in the documentation at least, marked as optional at the moment. This kind of is now. If you go look at the documentation, the type is. It's worth putting this in and seeing if it works anyway, without all this stuff. But again, you want to stay as correct as possible, so you should probably keep the relationship attribute. Or you could live on the edge, whichever. So one of the most useful things, and a quick example of why separation of concerns that we've already mentioned, so separating the style out from the presentation, why that is a good thing, is we can have multiple HTML pages, so index, movies, and music, and we can just have one style sheet that's referenced in them all, as you see here. So then we're sharing style across the entirety of our website. So now, if you think about if you had your style embedded in your content here, or even in a style tag in the head, you'd have to repeat that everywhere. And if you needed to change it, it'd be a maintenance nightmare. That's, one benefit of the whole separation of concerns idea. So a few terms I guess we've come across. We have rules, we have selectors, declarations, properties, and values. So when we were to look at a rule, we have a rule which is our contained, which has our selector, and our rule has a declaration, which is encompassed by our curly braces, and then our declaration is made up of multiple different properties. Typically, the words you end up using on a day-to-day basis when you're working with CSS is, selector and properties, really. And, when you're talking to another developer or someone else about these types of things, those are typically the words you end up using. So that is the first part. So we do have a lab you can jump into to start working with a bit of CSS. So we're coming up on, what are we, 40 minutes. So what I'll do here is I will take a break until let's say 20 past. That work for people? You want to go grab a coffee? And we can continue the rest of the lecture then. Cool. I'll see if I can put up some sort of timer here, and yeah, I'll see you all back here in 10 minutes. Cheers, folks. Okay, cool. So we'll move through to the next section then. We'll just look a bit deeper at CSS rules and their behavior. So just to recap, I guess on our CSS rules and our selectors and our properties, we have, different properties that we can set. One of those that you end up using quite a bit is border styles. So, you can see here, and this is a kind of a recap of what would have happened. You would have done in lab 1, where we can get my pencil back, control the bottom border of any element and give it a 1 pixel solid black, and you can go look and see kind of what's supported here. You can go look at MDN and kind of play around and mess around with those. But that's kind of what we end up with at the bottom here. We do something like that. So that's a border styles property. And you'll see us using this a lot as we work through our CSS examples, and different ways of applying borders as well, and different shortcuts there as well. So digging in a bit deeper to look at CSS selectors initially. So when we use selectors, we're essentially trying to find an element within sorry, 1 sec, just having some computer malfunctions. Second. Cool. Okay. All right, my laptop went a bit crazy there. Stream nearly crashed, but we'll keep going. So the CSS selectors, yeah, we have very simple selectors, and we can use, the element name itself, which we've been seeing and using. We can use IDs, or specific identifiers, to target a specific element itself singularly, or we can use a class to target multiple different elements with the same kind of subclass attached to them, and we'll see those now in a moment. And we can also have combined selectors, select elements based on a specific relationship between them. So, within the element denoted by a specific ID, there will be paragraphs, and we want the text in those colored blue. So there is a little bit of complexity with selectors. Generally, you want to keep your selectors as simple as possible. If you're writing code or CSS or JavaScript that's, multiple layers of selectors to do something, you probably just want to stick a class or an ID on it to make it a lot easier. If you have control over the HTML, I guess, and the styling, which you may not. Typically when you don't, maybe you're writing an application that can, read a web page kind of using JavaScript. So you can take it down, parse it, and you might need to get very inventive with the types of selectors you're using then. Okay, so just looking at some more rules, you can see we have different rules here for H1 and H2. And you see we're defining the same font in there and the same color in there. So that looks like a little bit of repetition, and it is. So what we can do is combine selectors so that, we can have one rule declaration on, multiple different selectors. So again, this is the example on the top right here that we were just working with, where H1 and H2 are the same. We can combine those into a single rule with 2 selectors and 1 declaration, so we're not repeating ourselves. So that's a useful optimization. So when we're adding a property to change the bottom border, we can, on both of them, we can just add it in the one place now, which is quite useful. Now, one thing we might also want to do is, yes, we have the majority of styles the same for H1 and H2, but maybe we want to add more style to H1 to make it stand out a little bit more. And we can do that by essentially just declaring H1 again, and giving it the bottom border like we did previously. So now both H1 and H2 share the font family and the color, but however, H1 has an underlying property on it. So the following kind of two rule sets are essentially produce the same output, right? So if we were to take a look, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different rules on paragraph, each with a separate property, but we can add them all together to fit within a singular rule. And I think we can all agree that's a little bit easier to deal with and a little bit easier to maintain as well. We can also, I guess if we jump back to the previous slide, we're putting multiple rules into the same rule using just the properties, single selector. But in this instance, we have multiple different selectors. So we have H1 to H6, and we want them all to be, the text in them to be maroon. Good choice color. So similarly, we can just, like we did with H1 and H2 previous, is just grab H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and set their color to be maroon. So we're combining the selectors so that we have a single declaration. So taking a look at, the selectors in a slightly different way. If we take a look at our H1, we are selecting any element that matches or that is a H1, on our page. And here we only really have one. There's a little note up the top right that we can only style elements in the body. We're not showing head elements and things like that. So we're not going to think about that right now. But this is a very simple selector. H1, we're just selecting the only heading of first kind of precedence on the page. And now when we use the combined selectors of H1 and H2, we're now selecting these two elements here. So pretty straightforward, I think. We're still happy enough there. And again, then, if you use the P selector, you're essentially defining a style for every paragraph on the page. So you're being, committed here. And so this selector will select all of the paragraphs we see here, typically anywhere on the page. Now, one thing we can start introducing to our elements to make them a bit more selectable and a bit more potentially specific, or increasing how, the different elements we can select with the rule. So you can use it to kind of expand the scope or decrease the scope of what you want to select, is we can use the class attribute. So the name of the element kind of specifies its type, but the class attribute lets you assign one or more subtypes. Is one way to think about it. So the subtypes may be used, I guess, for styling purposes in your CSS. So if several elements share a class, we can style them all together in a singular rule. So I guess this is our first time seeing this here. So here we have multiple different paragraphs, and we have the class attribute within those paragraphs. So we have a class of with style, a class of warning, and a class of warning as well. So we have 3 different paragraphs. The bottom 2 will be styled the same. and then the top one would be styled kind of independently. So you can see we now have a subtype where, you know, we have P, which is our type or paragraph type, and then the class with style is a subtype, and then the warning or warn, you know, is another subtype. So we've made, I guess, our selectors more selective. This is pretty standard practice. And so if we were to look at the actual style sheet, then we have our paragraph, and then notice that with our class, we have our full stop or period before the name. So with style and warn. So now you can see that, you know, we have a background color of white for our initial paragraph. Our with style has our olive color. Again, good choice of color. And our text is navy, so quite difficult to see there. And then we have our warning style, which is yellow and red. But we also have a paragraph over here, which I didn't highlight in the previous slide, where we have a span. And this is where we end up using the span that I said was practically useless in the last slide deck. But it's useless from the perspective of if you do nothing with it, it does nothing. So we're giving it a class of warn. So you can see we're inline text here. We're giving it, you know, the styling from the warning rule here. So great. We've kind of given ourselves a way of being a bit more kind of selective there. Now, we do have the ID attribute as well. So just I'll read from the slide to get it fully correct. You know, while the name of the element specifies its type, the ID lets you identify a specific element. So if you want to target elements by ID, you know, it means you can devise rules to pick out a specific paragraph buried in your page somewhere, or, you know, a button or something like that buried in your page somewhere. So IDs must be unique to the document. There can't be two elements with the same ID. If you do have the same ID, I'm pretty sure everything will render fine. But when you go and use a selector in something like JavaScript, you'll probably only pull back the first one that it comes across in the DOM tree. Now you might get a little warning maybe in the dev console to say you have two IDs the same, maybe. But you could set up rules within like build pipelines and things like that in your development process so that, you know, your website won't deploy if there's two elements with the same ID on the page, kind of thing. So back to our other example here, where we have our paragraph here with the attribute ID of first. And we can put anything in that string, but we want to make it, you know, pretty unique, I think. So we only ever have one first paragraph, so that's fine. And so we can see then the difference in how the styles are declared. We use the hash symbol down here for first, and that means it's an ID based selector. So the hash is an ID based selector. The dot, the full stop, the period, whatever you want to call it, is the class based selector, and then just on its own is the element based selector. So we can see on the first, we have a background color green and a text color of red, and that's melting my eyes even looking at that. That is beautiful. There you go. But we've got very specific with how we want to target that element by using the ID. And we should never have multiple of the same IDs on the page. Okay. So you can use what's called div or division to define different regions on the page. So we can use the division elements as containers, say one for the main content and one for, let's say, left content or something like a footer. We end up allocating an ID to each of these divisions. so that we can target them with CSS. And we'll do that, as part of a lab. And then your first assignment will use divisions a little bit. But what we'll end up doing is using divisions for a while and then moving into more semantically correct elements as well, introduced to HTML5 many, many years ago. But it's good to get a handle on what a division is, and see how you can use them to divide your page into different sections. So here we have a division ID of main content and a footer. We're missing our quotations there, so your alarm bells should be going off. But we'll just blame the diagram for that. And we can target those because they're IDs using the ID selector, which is a hash. So you could give them, different backgrounds, different fonts, depending on where they, the division of the page, essentially. Excuse me. So if we were to take our example further, we created a division for our main content, and then we created a division for our footer here. So our main content is all the way down here, and our footer is just here. So now we've divided up our page. And there are more correct ways of doing this, but while we're exploring the beginnings of HTML, this is the first way we look at dividing up a page. There are different ways of doing it, but this is the first way we look at. So we can see, the indentation as well as helping us figure out, what's the main content and what's the footer. So what can we do with that? So a very ugly example is we can target main content using the ID main content selector and, give it a border style of solid and with a width of 2 pixels. So that's that there. And then we can give our footer a dashed red border with a width of 2. Looks pretty nice. Cool. So that's a quick introduction to classes, IDs, and divisions, and how we can use those within selectors to style different elements and regions of the page. So again, we just have a couple more examples using similar approaches to just walk through here. Full screen. So just to have it more condensed and somewhere you can go look. So we'll just kind of review what we've done, where we have, I guess a smaller, more condensed slide deck. So it can be handy for revision essentially. So we have our class attribute, so classes define our subtypes, and then the subtypes are used within CSS for styling purposes. And we saw that, we see that when we can assign a class to our paragraph, we can essentially, be a bit more selective and not have to say we're styling every paragraph here. And it's probably worth mentioning as well that, as you can see in this example, the class, is not tied to the element type either. So you can have, the width style on any element on the page or any type of element on the page that you want to style. So they're not tied together. And again, then, we can see why we would do a subtype of a class. And we can also see, again, that you're using it within the paragraph, but also within the span. So just to recap again, then we have our ID attribute, where we want to select a singular element. And we can select that using the hash-based selector, which will select our ID. And then we come through to different divisions on the page. And, we can use, at this stage, we're going to use divisions to just outline, say, our main content and our footer. There are different ways of doing it, but this is what we're going to do initially. And then we can target those using different styles. And there's no special selector for a div. A div is just an element or division. You can see, we're using the ID selectors because those divisions have IDs. Cool. So if that's kind of your first time seeing those things, it can be good to kind of go over it a couple of times to get it kind of cemented in your head. If you've seen it before, it was probably too much repetition, but thanks for hanging in there. So I'll just give this a refresh because I was just fixing some of the labs there on the break because I was missing a link. So if we scroll down, we have our 2 labs here. I do have a walkthrough video as well for you to walk through this. So this will jump you straight into lab 2A, where you can start messing around with a bit more CSS. And again, then we have lab 2B, and this link should jump you into the video at the right time to get to this lab as well. So that is everything we have today. I can leave it there. I'll be around for another few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions on Slack or anything, I can answer that on Slack. But yeah, good luck with the lab, and feel free to ping into Slack if you have any issues.